by the military-industrial complex.
It could be seen to move violently forward, violently forward, violently forward.
I'm just a patsy. Let's win there.
I said this once or twice, but it bears repeating. If you like your current insurance, you will keep your current insurance.
You think about the Army and the Navy and the missions they run to protect the world, they run on SAC.
Well, you have done a really spectacular job. I guess pretty much everybody at this table is your customer, so
Exactly.
That's not so bad.
Exactly.
I want to congratulate
Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks.
And we're back. Today, we've got author and entrepreneur and all-around genius.
Oh no!
I don't know. I'm stuck for words. Robert Morris, the sixth generation descendant of this Robert Morris. Is that correct?
Well, he was my great-grandfather's great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather's great-grand... Okay, so well...
That's the easiest way to think of it, because you knew your great-grandfather, and my great-grandfather knew him.
Your great-grandfather knew him, and he was the CFO of the American Revolution. And just to let him explain it to the audience, there's a little video that you made that I've prepared to show people. So we could start off with that.
Greetings, I am Robert Morris. America is a country full of entrepreneurs, but few know the historical basis for their existence. The country's history is presented as a narrative where slave-holding farmers of the South and the hard-scrapple fishermen and sailors of New England somehow created a nation that utilizes banks, credit, manufacturing, and commerce to become the richest nation on earth. This makes no sense, so to answer the question they add in Hamilton, who was a political appointee for 5 years. Oddly, Hamilton was not an entrepreneur. He was a lawyer and soldier. The true answer lies in understanding my 30-year career. I signed the 3 founding documents of America. I was an entrepreneur, smuggler, privateer owner, founder of the first bank, and senator who championed the free enterprise system against the slave power and street mob justice. Oh, and I just happened to finance the revolution. Why don't people know this? Late in life, I overextended myself, went bankrupt, and then my political party lost the election of 1800. The people who defeated me were not interested in giving me credit for my work, as they endeavored to grab the glory and nation for themselves. Read all about it in Roger Morris, Inside the Revolution by my sixth great-grandson, Roger M. Morris.
Roger.
Yep, he got that wrong, but nobody's 100%,
No, yeah, AI. It's all AI. In case anybody didn't know, that was AI. So maybe we should start off by talking a little bit about why people don't know this story. When you and I first started conversing, I turned you onto a book that I've only discovered recently called "The Poisoned Loving Cup," which uncovers a century-long attempt by primarily Rhodes scholars to recast American history as the revolution is just kind of a little bump in the road between the good relations between the Great Britain and North America, and that we're all good friends now. And one of the things that I noticed, I want to say I first start, because I've been studying history my entire life, and I used to liken myself to being an expert on World War II. I didn't know what I was talking about, but I had read all of the conventional stuff that people would read in order to make themselves learned, as it were. And it occurred to me about 20 years ago that nobody ever fights a war without a bank. Like if you're not funding this thing, people don't usually have the wherewithal to get up and decide that they're going to organize and go, pillage their neighbors. And so it was with great kind of like aha moment when I started to take a look at your book, which you so kindly sent me, I guess 6 or 8 months ago, and started to realize, George Washington did have a banker behind him, because at that time Alexander Hamilton was like his aide de camp, right? Yep. He was a lieutenant, and he was jumping over walls with a sword. He wasn't making sure that Washington had food, uniforms, and ammunition. And so,
well, the thing about you fall into exactly the kind of training we all get in America as school children, which is that the American Revolution was a popular uprising and everybody just got together and had a war and won it, Right. And this was how it was originally pitched to the population. And unfortunately, people got caught out with that. And they went bankrupt, and it was a big mess. So they called in my guy Morris, and he kind of said, you got to grow up. We got to make money here. We have to pay each other. And, they even tried to supply the military with a barter system by sending wagon loads of food from New England to the South.
Right.
So,
in a process that would take weeks or months.
Right. So, and then where was the army by the time the food got there? It's kind of difficult to do that.
Right. Well, he also managed to create and run the United States Navy, which didn't exist for all intents and purposes before he started. And what I didn't understand before I read the book is that a lot of it had to do with the issuing of letters of marque and reprisal, where they would hire freelance pirates, as it were, in the vein of Sir Francis Drake, and say, here, we've given you this letter that will allow you to go steal from the British on the open seas, and you can keep a percentage of whatever you steal, but you have to bring it back to us. Do I have that correct?
That was basically it, except the problem they ran into in Europe was that you had to bring the stuff back to sell it, to make the money.
Right.
So when they brought it back to European ports to try to sell it, like the people in Holland were going, you got this from the English, we're giving it back to them. So it was kind of tough going. They were lucky they didn't get hung as pirates, so at least they got a little, little nice treatment.
Right, and Matt Arrett always likes to talk about the League of Armed Neutrality, which was set up by Catherine the Great, and you point out in the book that didn't actually work out that well.
No, what happened was what that meant was if you were a British ship, you would get attacked by the privateers, but if you were a French ship, you wouldn't because they were theoretically neutral. So the English were loading their goods onto French ships. So, that didn't really work out.
Right, and so there's all kinds of nuance to the way that the wars were being fought. A lot of, what we learn is that there are these battles, these kind of set piece battles, and that the war is determined based on the outcome of these set piece battles. But as you go into so much detail about what happened before the Battle of Yorktown, how it was financed, because everybody who fought in that battle needed to be fed, they needed to be armed, they needed to be transported to where they were going, and they weren't doing it in a way that was uncompensated. They were getting paid for what they were doing. And then at the end of the battle, there still needed to be some settlement made. And we had 13 different, for all intents and purposes, independent countries that were supposed to be carrying their own load or sharing the load as far as what it cost. But they each had independent armies, kind of like we have National Guards now. And then there was a national army, and then there was always kind of this tug of war for finances. You want to go into like the financing of Yorktown and the tobacco deals?
The Yorktown project was very interesting because Washington was stuck in New York State, and he didn't know. I mean, everybody expected him to do something. He had an army. He had to do something with it. And he was going, well, am I going to go to New York? Am I going to go to Virginia? And as it turned out, a guy named Lord Admiral Rodney had just finished pillaging St. Eustatius, where he had punished the Dutch for joining up with the Americans and taken many shiploads of treasure from St. Eustatius. So he took that back to England instead of going to help in Yorktown. And so when they knew he was going to England, Washington went down to Yorktown. But he didn't have the money to do it, so Morris basically put up over $1 million of his own money to get him down there. And so he ran around and he borrowed all this cash, and he talked to the French, and he borrowed $36,000 worth of silver coins to show the army that he actually had the money to pay them. So when he got there, they opened up the coins and they showed the army. But he had to arrange the French to attack at the Battle of the Capes because he was entertaining the French ambassador in Philadelphia, I'm sorry. Yeah. And he was also the agent of Marine, so he was in charge of the Navy at the time. So he got the French to attack the Battle of the Capes. He got the cannon in there. And then Washington went from to Elkton down to Yorktown on ships, and he arranged that. And then by the time they got there, they had the silver. They were all cheered up, and they went after Yorktown, the Battle of Yorktown, and they won, much to the English surprise. And when they finally won, and they brought all the standards of all the troops back to Philadelphia, the Congress was watching this parade of all these standards coming by, and they were suddenly awestruck with the magnitude of having beaten the British Army.
Right.
They were like,
so
oh my God.
Do we know what happened to those standards? Where are those standards now?
I don't know. There would be an interesting artifact.
I would certainly like to go see them because I don't know. At this point, I'm of the mind that this was the Battle of Yorktown was a battle that they lost, and they never lost sight of the prize that was North America, and it took them until December 24th, 1913 to actually complete their reconquista as the Spanish might say, of the United States, and we've been kind of living in this fairy tale ever since.
Coasting on the memories of our victory.
Or on the projected dreams of media, because again, getting back, one of the things that I was taken by when I read the introduction of the book was that there's only 4 books that have been written about Robert Morris in, I don't know, 150 years or 200 years.
I think 10.
Okay.
But there are hundreds that are written on the other side on Jefferson and Washington and all these other people, because people, look, if you're trying to be a giant financier in the world and you want to keep everybody under control, you don't want to teach them how to conduct a war, a revolution. You want to teach them how to fail at that. So you don't say, well, you need funding. You don't show how the funding works. You pretend the funding isn't really an issue. So you're not going to talk about the financier.
Right, and that's this book is full of that, and it's and the amount of details. Talk about the process a little bit. How long did it take you to collect all of this stuff and put it together? Because this book is mostly based on primary sources. You went and read the letters and all of those types of things, right?
Well, it took me about 7 years to write the book, and luckily, the University of Pittsburgh had collected Morris's letters in the papers of Robert Morris, and Elizabeth Nuxall was the editor, and a fellow named Ferguson, and they did a great job putting them all together. But it sits on your shelf, and it's about a yard of books. And so there's a lot of reading to be done there. But then there's also the naval documents of the American Revolution and all of these congressional documents and the Continental Congress documents. You just have to look for them and read them and follow them and look at the footnotes. I mean, the thing about Morris is he kind of rests in the footnotes. But the interesting thing about the history of Robert Morris's historiography is that the first book written about the American Revolution was written by the son-in-law of Morris's arch enemy.
Right.
So he was just a backbencher as far as these guys were concerned. They just put him in the backbench. Oh yeah, Morris was part of the congressional delegation from Pennsylvania. And even to this day, up to the last biography of Adams, that's how Morris is portrayed, because that's become canon. And that's kind of the problem, is that people go, okay, fine. And then you had the thing Morris really did as a revolutionary act was incorporated the laissez-faire free enterprise system into the DNA of a country. Other countries were run by kings, and a king is basically the head of a large company, and it's a vertically integrated monopoly for a geographical area, and he doles out favors to his friends and punishes his enemies and that kind of thing. America is very different, and just starting off something that was based on free trade and benefit for everybody who can figure out how to make a buck by serving his neighbor. It's a remarkable revolutionary act, whereas every country in the world is based on serfdom or slavery, forced labor, war, grabbing stuff from other people, and domination. And even in America, the same spirit of domination was found in the South with their slave economy, and they weren't really flexible enough to go, well, yeah, let's just embrace this modern theory of Adam Smith and free enterprise and just give everything up and we'll follow this idea. They thought that's too wacky. People just need to buckle down and grow corn and eat it.
Right.
Kind of limiting, in fact. And as time went along, the South was and the North was growing in industrial might. They proved to themselves it was backwards, and they were like, what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of this? So if they just not abused Morris and let him continue, it would have been better for everybody.
Sure. I mean, I have plenty of critiques for Adam Smith and that mindset, but I understand that within the frame of moral philosophy, which is, I think Adam Smith was a student of moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, I believe, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. That was certainly like a zeitgeist that was going around at that point. But the Lee brothers are a very prominent. Are they brothers? Yeah.
There were 5 Lee brothers. There were 5 of them.
The Lee brothers are a very prominent part of your book, and maybe you want to explain a little bit about the idea of trying to provide supplies to an army during a war, and then how you actually manifest that without having, for all intents and purposes, you had a freelance quartermaster corps, and the government tried to do it a couple of different ways and failed. And Morris came in at the end and put together a system that worked, but it also opened him up to a bunch of personal criticism. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, first, what happened in the beginning was that everybody was like, yeah, let's go beat the English. I'm going to give you 20 bales of hay and you can feed the horses. And the guy, I'll give you the shoes. And then the states said they promised these requisitions, a certain amount of goods for the war. And that ended up being somewhat like a barter system. And it didn't work because they were valued at about twice the market rate. So they're taking advantage of the government, and which, of course, has happened forever. And, so no surprise there. And so Morris came in and he said, look, you've driven the country into bankruptcy. That's why you gave me this job. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to do competitive bidding for contracts. We're going to pay the contractors with money. And the contractors will be where the army is, and they will find things and they'll feed the army. And then he said, well, I know you're not really thrilled with this because you like this other system. So I'll start it out with my own cash. And so he was writing these checks, and he'd say, well, here's a check for the army. And then the check would go to the farmer, and the farmer, it would go to the contractor, it would go to the farmer. The farmer would then pay his taxes with it, and the tax money would go to the state, and the state would remit the money to Morris, and he'd get the check back and he'd rip it up. Ta-da! Pay the army, feed the army with this. But what happened was that he only did this as a short-term solution, and he said, look, the rest of the states now have to turn over their contributions, their requisitions in terms of money. And suddenly, no, well, we're very busy. We've already given enough. We don't have any money. And all this shucking and jiving was going on. And the states didn't give, I mean, one year, Pennsylvania gave $700. That was like it. And he put in more of his own money than all the states combined, because they thought, oh, we just got rid of the king. This guy's going to be the new king. And this was all the kind of slander that was running around. And
that Morris was going to be the new king.
Yeah, they thought he was taking over the whole country. And this was a reaction. They didn't really think this. They wanted to preserve their slave-based economy, because Morris and his friends were all, well, they weren't directly abolitionists, like they weren't firebrands or anything, but they were trying to ease away from it. Pennsylvania had passed the abolition law in 1780. And so they didn't really want to continue that system, because if you have a slave system, you don't have a market. There's nobody to buy anything except the landholder. It's just an oligarchy.
You'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right?
That was kind of the system he was trying to get rid of. Yeah, exactly. But the people who were running that system were like, well, we like it this way, and so we're going to give you a hard time, and if you go bankrupt, then you'll leave us alone. So he had to keep so what he did is he put these checks out, and then before he flopped over in bankruptcy, they'd get a loan from the French king, and he'd suddenly be able to do the old switcheroo, change his debts for this cash, and he kind of, he funded the war, but he got paid back.
Yeah, weren't there also controversies where the French would loan the Americans money, but then the American colonists were spreading a rumor that the French had just given us the money out of the goodness of their hearts and that they didn't expect it to be repaid?
This was an interesting thing. This guy named Arthur Lee, who is the little brother of the guy who inherited the family plantation, he was kind of jealous of everything. And he hated Franklin. He said the only way I could sell real estate when he was competing with Franklin is if Franklin died. I mean, that he was a bitter pill, this guy. So he thought that as an agent, and he should control all of he should control the trade from the war trade, which meant he would get 3% on everything bought and sold. So when he wasn't
so people were making
involved,
there was more than patriotism going on here. People were making lots of money doing this.
Oh yeah, well Arthur Lee wanted to get his 3% commission on all the war supplies that were coming to America, but he wasn't part of the deal. So Beaumarchais, who was the secret agent for the French, sent ships to America on a handshake because he thought the Americans were really brave for going against the British who'd just beaten them in the 7-Year War. And so Arthur Lee said, oh, these are just gifts. You don't have to pay him back, because he wasn't getting a percentage. And he built up this whole ridiculous thing, which ended up blowing up in Congress, and Henry Lawrence ended up quitting being the head of Congress because he was on the wrong side. And it worked out very badly for those guys. But it was just myth making with this fabulous. They had this idea that if they could just convince everybody that the French were giving them money, then that was because they were so virtuous. That's kind of the zeitgeist to this day. We hear all of these stories about how what's the French guy who worked with Washington? There's Lafayette Park across from the White House, right? That Lafayette just kind of came over here, and out of the graciousness of his heart, and Lafayette wound up having his own comeuppance too, but they just came over here out of the goodness of their heart. That the Polish general, who I'm trying to remember his name, I can't remember. Steuben?
Was it von Steuben? There's 4 guys there's a statue in Lafayette Park with these 4 generals that came over from Europe to kind of help us out, and that they were all here out of the goodness of their own heart, and that they were all trying to help America. And that's true to a certain extent, but they were also getting paid. They were soldiers
of fortune. They were, they weren't able to just, give up everything and come to America for nothing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, too, that, we don't learn when we're learning military history, a commissioned officer is commissioned because he gets a commission of the booty that gets grabbed by, they're basically land pirates, right? So they're, and the reason that you didn't say this specifically in the book, but I kind of intuited it out of something that you wrote in the book, which is that officers are called officers because they do a lot of office work where they have to figure out how to get their men paid, how to get their uniforms, how to get them ammunition. So they're in an office a lot. They're going to the office to get all of this stuff organized so that they can get all this stuff. Do I have that correct?
Well, let's put it this way. There were, people who were in the supply business, and they were on commission. So during the Revolutionary War, up until the time Lawrence took over the Congress, the supply officers were working as commission agents, and they were supplying the army. And when he stopped that and put them on salary, everybody with talent left the job. And then you had government sector workers.
Which is the truth to this day. Yeah.
Right, which is why the army was starving in Valley Forge. Because everybody who knew what they were doing had gone. And then you had the Pennsylvania state government, which had only been actually meeting for about half a year, which it took 9 months to create a government after they declared independence. The Pennsylvania state government was not particularly popular. They were just in charge. And they were
And in charge, in order to be in charge, though, it meant you had to show up. And if you didn't actually have anyone showing up, then no one was in charge, right?
Well, what they did is they ran their government kind of like if Antifa took over the government. So the state of Pennsylvania was run by these guys who were not in favor of, landholders and things like that. And they disenfranchised the Quakers and the Jews and the Mennonites because they were going to vote them out. And so they took over, and then they had what they called ad hoc committees. And these ad hoc committees were just really a bunch of bully boys who would go around and enforce the will of the assembly, which meant taking people's, flour or stopping their ships or whatever they happened to think was anti-patriotic. So it was kind of a wild time. I mean, there was something called the Fort Wilson riot in the middle of Philadelphia, which ended up with shooting, and they almost were aiming a cannon at the crowd before the militia showed up and stopped them. I mean, these were difficult times. And what they did in the assemblies, they spent most of their time abusing the Quakers, because the Quakers were like, well, we're peaceful. We don't care about this war. And they're going, well, you're helping the English. And so they took a whole bunch of them and sent them out of state. And these guys were going, we didn't do anything. It was wild time. It was really, and they shut down the theater as well.
The
they weren't
theater,
fun.
They shut down the theater because
I'm not sure exactly what their motivation was.
Popular media. Well, my guess is that it's popular media. I mean, James II came in, I think, and shut down the theater also.
I think they were making fun of them. I think that's why they shut them down.
Yeah, it's Saturday Night Live, right? It winds up,
right.
It's the version of Saturday Night Live. Yeah. So one of the things that Morris is a reoccurring theme in this book is that Morris was always trying to come up with a different way to finance things, and he wanted taxes. And I think that I'm at a point in the book where he's talking about a tax for every $1 a year or something like that for every man between 16 and 60, unless they've been injured in the war. $1 for every acre of land, and which would be a radical impact on people like the Lee brothers because they had huge amounts of land. And then a tax on spirits. And I know that later on, when Alexander Hamilton finally became the Secretary of the Treasury, that they did wind up having that whiskey rebellion. And it seemed curious to me, was the tax on spirits because it was seen as a sin tax? Or is there a particular reason? Because I think that again, a tax on tobacco disproportionately affects people in Virginia. A tax on spirits disproportionately affects the people in Western Pennsylvania. Like, what do you think the decision-making process was for determining what we're going to, levy taxes against as opposed to other things?
Well, I think the taxes were politically pointed. I mean, he was trying to break up the land monopolies with the land tax. He was trying to punish slaveholding with the slave tax, with the head tax, because you had to pay tax on every slave. And then the whiskey tax is interesting because what people were doing is they were cooking up their whiskey and using it as money, right? So they were bartering with the whiskey to buy things and sell things. So what basically they were saying, look, you can't just make your own money and use it as currency, which is basically, I mean, it's like the weed economy, right?
Right.
People who grow weed, they say, okay, fine, here's a whatever, and give me your car, So you can't really have people making their own money and using it in trade. So that's basically what that was about. And the idea was, well, if you have to pay the government a little bit, at least you can do it, but you owe us something.
Well, that reminds me, though, of what happened with the weed economy and Bitcoin. Because California legalized the sale of weed, but it was still a felony to take money that you made from selling weed and putting it into a bank account. And so what a lot of people don't understand is that drove the weed dealers in California into Bitcoin. So many, because the weed dealers, they were having problems. They would, in Indian reservations, there were actually little, they weren't banks per se, but they were shipping containers filled with cash that were surrounded with ribbon wire and guarded by dogs and men with guns, where the weed dealers were taking their cash and putting it into shipping containers. And so they started investing in Bitcoin. And part of what initially, I think, drove up the price of Bitcoin was weed dealers in California who were converting their Bitcoin, their cash from their stores into Bitcoin, because that way they could have some kind of way to transport that money around and get around the federal laws that were preventing them from doing that. So there's always a way, right? If you create a system where it's illegal to do it in one way, it seems like people will always find another way to go and execute the same thing.
Well, as Morris said, people weren't really devoted to the idea of paying taxes, even in those days.
So I don't want to. So White Rose says convoluted Cali laws make for the loophole clause. Or again, the way that I look at things like things now, did California create this loophole on purpose in order to drive money into the Bitcoin economy? Like, was that the entire purpose of legalizing weed, still having it be a felony to put the money in the bank, and then knowing that people are going to be selling this stuff and they have to do something with it, right? Then that becomes the question.
Well, the topic of Bitcoin is not really my expertise, but it's all well and good until the power goes out.
Right, exactly. And whiskey's much better than Bitcoin at that point. And
a couple of cases of Johnny Walker.
Exactly. I prefer the Jameson myself, but I digress. Anyway, I wanted to circle back to the 7 years that it took you to put the book together, and the fact that you've got an extensive technology background. One of the things that you told me when you introduced yourself to me is that you put together one of the first multimedia programs, or if the first multimedia program that came out a year before HyperCard. And for old people like me,
You're just a kid.
HyperCard was the original multimedia program that you could make basically an animated slideshow with on an Apple Macintosh computer. But your software predated that by a year. You want to, and where I'd like to bring this is that, ultimately the question I want to ask you is, what technology, or what was the process of you, with your background in technology, did you take advantage of technology in order to be able to kind of take this 7-year process and then condense all of these notes and everything that you had into something that you could turn into a book?
Well, that's kind of two different questions. I'll tell you, I just wrote the book the old-fashioned way, which was I wrote it out, and then I wrote it out, and then I wrote it out again. I just worked like the devil on the thing. And the reason I even started was because the National Park Service asked me to do a PowerPoint on Morris because they didn't know anything about him. And so I started working on it, and it just swelled up out of control. And now I've got a book. Now, as far as the technology thing was, I was a filmmaker, and I was working at WGBH for a while, and I was doing freelancing. And then I got into doing laser discs because I visited the Media Lab back in the late 70s, early 80s.
I had a stack of laser discs.
And I thought, this is great. And then I was involved in doing Laserdisc projects, and they were, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I thought, maybe we can do something differently. And I started doing demo discs, which we spent all our time doing graphics and not so much doing programming. And then the guy I was working with said, look at these frame grabber boards. And there were these little boards you could grab still frames from videotape. And I said, well, let's use these to make slideshows. And so we developed a way of doing that. And then there was this little phone answering device called the Watson board. And we converted the output of the Watson board, which was really just for, RJ11 connections on telephones.
Isn't that the same board that Jobs and Wozniak used for phreaking? I
don't know if they did, because it was a PC-based product, not a Apple-based product. But maybe they had an Apple version of it. I don't know.
No, this was before computers. But anyway,
so the Watson board PCs. Was an audio thing. It allowed you to digitize your voice. We digitized our voices and other voices, and we were able to synchronize them with the slides, and we had a little multimedia thing, and then we added sprites and text and basically reproduce what you could do for $100,000, $200,000 for like $10,000-$15,000. And so we were doing that, and we just did it as a service. And then we found a publisher, and that's a whole different thing. That was a big mess.
Right.
But anyway, we had fun with it for a long time, and now it's in the Smithsonian.
Your software is in the Smithsonian. Is it like a floppy disk in a lucite frame, or how does that work?
Well, we sent it down to them, and it had all the boxes and the computer we wrote it on and all this stuff, and they just didn't know what to do with it, and so they categorized it by the computer, and they said, "Oh, this is an AT&T computer." And by the way, it was used to write the software. And I've argued with them for years about that's really not the point. So they have their own agenda down there. I'm not exactly sure what it is.
Well, Matt Ehret, I think, has written a lot about the Smithsonian's agenda, which seems to be to cast science in a direction that the oligarchs want science to go in.
Well, the oligarchs are particularly thrilled with the fact that this invention, which basically is a new medium, was created by two guys working out of their house.
Right. Even though that's always the Horatio Alger myth, right? That it's two guys, Jobs and Wozniak were two guys in a garage. That Larry Page and Sergey Brin were two guys who were working in a garage. It's always two guys in a garage.
And a banker.
And a banker.
We never got the banker, so we were just two creative guys.
The other part that they leave out, though, is that the banker already has the invention because it was developed by DARPA, but it was classified so nobody knows that it exists. So when these two geniuses unveil it upon the world, they get to take the credit. They get to take all that intellectual property public with an IPO. And wink, wink, nod, nod. There's some people who got founder shares who had positions in the government who leaked the technology to the banker in the first place, and they're all on their yachts in the Mediterranean right now.
Well, that's not me.
Yeah.
I'm just a guy who with a few good ideas and a pair and some fingers, and we made it happen. We did some other interesting work. We created the and we got a patent on this other thing. It was basically, we were inventing a way of creating software with graphics. So you could connect the graphics up to make the software. And we had to make these little components. And we had to add the components, and we had the system adding components from the network, which ended up being bought. That patent was bought by Google, and it's the basic operating system that makes apps work in phones.
Interesting. And so you get a quarter of a cent every time I click on an app. Is that
Well, that's not how it actually works. No, that was a different thing. That was something else. But we did actually sell that, and it worked out okay. But it didn't live up to my dreams of avarice. But I had enough money to be able to work on my book, and that was satisfactory.
Dreams of Avarice. That sounds like another book.
Yeah, it would be good. Yeah.
And you were also involved with. So my career, I was a computer science major in college. I dropped out of school to be a fashion photographer. I did that for a while. When the internet took off, I could answer the questions that the marketing people were asking and the questions that the engineers were asking. So I built the xfiles.com and foxsports.com and a bunch of stuff for 20th Century Fox, first generation, the first websites that they ever built. And then I helped work on the Hollywood Stock Exchange with Max Kaiser. I helped design video games for Steven Spielberg at a place called Sega GameWorks. And then I ran e-commerce for Virgin. So I've worked for all of these different oligarchs, right, all along the way. But while I was at GameWorks, Spielberg came into the office one day and asked my boss what we were going to put on we were building these location-based entertainment places. They were called GameWorks, and basically they were arcades with a bar. And Spielberg asked, what are you going to put on the video monitors up around the bar? And my boss said, oh, we were going to play music videos. And Spielberg said, no, you're not. And my boss said, we're not. And he goes, Spielberg looked at him and he said, you're going to need to figure out a way to make video games watchable, like spectator sports. And that was it. He walked out, and my boss turned to me and he goes, this is your job from now on, which is a job that I loved. And I did it even after GameWorks kind of imploded a year later, and I was halfway through developing this project, but I didn't let go of it for like 5 years. And again, this is the late 1990s, and spectator video game sports didn't happen for probably another 15 years after that. But I was actively working on technology and trying to get something off the ground. And I understand you had a very similar background.
Well, I was trying to develop a similar game show. I thought it'd make a great game show, but I think the TV, and I talked to Sony about it, they were horrified that there was so much violence in these games. They thought that kind of violence was better just personally instead of broadcast all over the world. So then it ended up on Twitch, and people have that going now. So I think we were just pre-Twitch.
Yeah, it's funny. I won't run this right now, but somebody actually, let me fix it. Somebody actually did a video. Yes. Anyway, so somebody found this piece of software that I had created during this time, and this guy spent years trying to figure out who I was and why it was made and who did it, and he wound up making a whole video about it. So it's kind of funny. But you and I both decided that Counter-Strike was kind of like the way to go, right?
Well, I was looking at a lot of different, I was talking to these Russian developers too. And I was talking to the guys at id and whoever I could figure out, even, anybody. It didn't work out. So the thing that really killed it was 9/11. That's what happened. I was, closing in on a deal, and then it was just real war was too important and everything else happened.
Right, and there was something similar also going on, because I was working for, this was after 9/11, but I was, during this period of time, the United States Army came out with a video game called America's Army, and they were spending $6 to $10 million a year on software development and creating a video game that they were giving away for free out on the internet, so people could go play this game. And, me being the retard that I was, looked at this and thought, why is the U.S. Army competing with EA and Activision? Like, why are they out there developing software? And, of course, it's because they were using it to fool young males into believing that if they signed up for the Army, they could go play a game in real life. which I think they probably did a very good job of. And unfortunately, many of those people are victims of that at this point. Not to mention
especially the drone operators. Those guys suffered the most, I think.
You think?
Oh yeah. I mean, can you imagine you're actually a drone operator and you're doing real damage, and then you walk out of your door and it's like, 7-Eleven chicken wings, and you're back at home and going to Walmart. It'd be kind of disorienting.
Yeah, I do. I do have a buddy who wrote a screenplay for a movie like that, actually. It is kind of disorienting. I guess the thing that's really kind of crazy to me right now is that people are really dying. And we've done a really good job of disassociating. I remember there was a guy named Thomas Lakeman. I interviewed to be the creative director of this big internet startup company, and I didn't want to leave the job that I had, but the guy who was recruiting me, we had a very interesting conversation. We were talking about Quake, and I was talking about the fact, that I didn't have a problem with the violence in Quake because everything that you were trying to kill in Quake was trying to kill you.
Right.
I had big, huge moral problems with. There was a game that they wanted me to put into GameWorks called Redneck Rampage. And I knew the developers of the game. I liked them. I thought they were nice guys. But the idea of Redneck Rampage was kind of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And the idea was aliens had come down to this small town in Mississippi and body snatched all of the hillbillies that lived in this small town. And so what you had to do in this video game is that you had to go kill aliens. But the aliens
Except they happen to look like hillbillies.
They all look like hillbillies. So it was a game where you killed hillbillies. That was the game. And and the chairman of the board of GameWorks was also on the board of directors of the Show Foundation Institute, which was next door. And he wanted me to put this game into GameWorks, and I told him that I thought, and he said, well, it's another shooter. It's like Quake. And I said, no, in Quake, everybody that you're shooting is trying to shoot you. Like it's a survival game, right? In Redneck Rampage, you're killing hillbillies. And he goes, well, what's wrong with that?
Yeah. What's your problem?
I said, what if the aliens landed in Poland and all of the bodies that they occupied were Jews? And the object of the game was to go around killing Jews. Would you have a problem with that? Because I have that problem with killing hillbillies.
What was his reaction?
He said, put the game in, Peter. That was the end of the conversation.
That was it.
That was it.
Well, he had money in the game, so there you go.
Yeah, so I didn't last there much longer, because again, having ethics and credit and thinking of your own credibility is not obviously a way to get ahead.
This is the problem with working with oligarchs.
Yeah.
That's how they think.
Right, and this was very much oligarch thinking, right?
Yeah.
He also happened to be a stockholder in the video game company that made Redneck Rampage, so it was important to him that he get his. Basically, GameWorks was going to have to license Redneck Rampage, and when GameWorks licensed Redneck Rampage, then he would get his vig on the back end for owning stock in that company. So
no conflict of interest there.
Right.
No.
But which brings us back to this book, because this book is filled with people who have similar. Most of the people that Morris was having problems with during the American Revolution, I think that I could probably categorize as he was negatively impacting their ability to generate revenue. And at the same time that he was doing that, he was risking everything. Is that safe to say?
Well, that's exactly what was going on. I mean, he was trying to implement something called, well, it's basically an import duty, so he could pay for the war, because the states weren't voluntarily coming up with any money. But under the Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous. And then they ran into the fact that the people in Rhode Island who made all their money shipping things like slaves didn't want to pay a duty. They didn't want to be involved in that. And so they said, oh, well, you're just trying to take over the world. And they made his name very dark. And they said, this is terrible. You're trying to be the king. But in the meantime, they were betting for and against it with the loan office certificates. And as the value of the loan office certificates went up and down based on what they were doing in the State House, they were making money. So they were basically just hosing everybody who they were betting against. And then they said, no, we're not going to do it. And the whole thing fell apart, and they made lots of money on state loan certificates. So
Yeah,
one of the things that this family was doing, they were running huge privateer operations, and they made a lot of money doing that. And they ended up starting a college, which is now known as Brown University.
Brown University. Well, we could talk about that in 1 second. But Mellow Cat Algo said, we went from the revolution to aliens and hillbillies. Yes, we did. You never know when you get on the Duke Report. You never know what's going to happen.
Well, they're just digital aliens.
Right. It just turns out that Robert and I have a lot of similar background, and so I thought I would share that with people because it gives us an opportunity to tell stories that we probably of interest to people. And I think that the hillbilly story was interesting. Even though it didn't have much to do with the Revolutionary War. So that does seem to be an ongoing situation as people have conflicting financial interests, whether or not they're going to be able to get ahead or not. And so what lessons do you think that people could learn from this book in taking a look at what's going on today, right now? Because
let me just try to answer that.
Okay.
What Morris did by weaving the free market system into America is he started an engine that was not stoppable. And it ended up defeating slavery. It ended up winning world wars. And everybody wants to control it. But the thing is, the freer it is, the better it works. And that's kind of that's kind of how it goes. And the people who try to control it, they try to suck all the money out of it, and then they cripple it.
Well, I'm gonna make the argument that that's not necessarily so.
Well, okay, that's fair.
And well, let me just hear me out. I used to believe that until I realized, and again, this is kind of the Lyndon LaRouche organization worldview, that free trade is great as long as you control the trade going in and out of your own country, and you control the means by which that trade is enacted. That is, the British Empire loves to talk about free trade as long as they control the seas and as long as they control who gets to manufacture things and who gets to buy things.
Well, it's not actually very free then, is it?
No, it's not very free. And so that's why a red flag always goes up whenever I hear Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and a red flag goes up whenever I hear free trade, because and maybe the thing that, I voted for Donald Trump. I worked for the Stop the Steal campaign. I unregistered to vote on or about January 7th, 2021, because I saw what was going on in Washington, D.C. that day, and I just didn't want to play anymore in that game. But so I say that as a preamble to the idea that one of the things that Donald Trump did was when he first, like day one, is that he put tariffs up on China. And again, I'm not a China derider. I'm not a Russia derider. I don't particularly think that they're better or worse than any other country that's trying to look out for its own interests. But he put up those tariff barriers, and that was a great thing for me from my standpoint.
Well, let me just say, when I talk about the free enterprise system, I'm not talking about free trade per se. Free trade is a way of disrupting the market to get yourself in there. That's what that's about. And hurting somebody else's protected market. Free enterprise is when individuals can start companies on their own and sell things and make things and sell them to each other and create commerce between people.
Create value.
And create value, have a value-add economy. That's what I was talking about, not international free trade arrangements, which even in America, we had these free trade arrangements with the French And the only place they actually ended up being were in the French trade islands like Réunion, because they didn't want to land their ships in unfriendly places. So they sent the Americans in.
Well, you told a funny story too in the book about Saint Eustatius. Is that
Yep,
do I have
Saint
that
Eustatius.
that Rodney went down there. Rodney, who the battleship Rodney that helped sink the Bismarck, was actually named for the same guy, I believe.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Rodney went down there and pillaged those islands, but then he sent a lot of the goods that he was sending back to England got recaptured by the French. Did I get that correct? Like 29 ships worth of booty or something?
Yep. So all of his plunder was taken from him, and then he got scolded by Edmund Burke in the House of Commons for his trouble.
And they still named a battleship after him.
Well, he was one of the good old boys, you know.
Indeed. So that didn't work out well. So he stole all that booty. The French grabbed it back, and then did they give that back to the United States, the Americans?
I don't know what the resolution of that was. Maybe they figured, well, we're going to keep it because it's ours now. But Morris lost a lot of his ships in St. Eustatius because he was smuggling tobacco through there.
Right, and he had warehouses and all kinds of stores down there also, right?
Yeah, well, he said he lost 250 ships during the war, but just about broke even. So
because he captured 250 ships.
Yeah, it's kind of the way it worked out. But when he lent the money for the Battle of Yorktown, $1.3 million at the time, well, that works out to somewhere around $100 billion now in modern currency, which is pretty remarkable.
Right. So he kind of was the George Soros of North America, the original George Soros.
Well, except with a different intention. I mean, people say he was the richest man in America, but he didn't have 5,000 acres and 200 slaves and a guaranteed income for life. He had to work for a living. And unfortunately, he, overstretched his abilities, and he was attacked in the courts. I don't know if you really want to get into that. You haven't read this part of the book, but there's a guy named Aaron Burr. He shot Hamilton.
Yep.
Well, another thing he did before that was he was the Attorney General of New York State, and he joined into a small controversy where Morris was being sued over the matter of a mortgage, and he had been using this plot of land he owned as kind of a funding source, a capital source. But this plot of land was 200 square miles. So this was like his capital base. And Aaron Burr said, well, let me just join into this little controversy here. And he ended up taking the property from Morris, and he just lost it. Because he was on the wrong. So, that was lawfare, 18th century style.
Right. Didn't Aaron Burr, though, wind up having to flee the United States of America and then wound up living at Jeremy Bentham's house in London for the rest of his life?
Well, he was the vice president for a while, too. He had an interesting career.
Well, again, I don't want you to give away too much because I'm going to finish reading this book. But
okay.
Let me see if there's it looks like we have one question. Zaga Nostra says, did Morris have a general theory of economics like Adam Smith?
Well, his theory of economics was let it be free as air. Let everybody, participate in it, and the country will grow. Economic freedom, as far as he was concerned, was equivalent to political freedom.
And that's how real good. And what's interesting too about it is that if he does have, I told somebody on Substack the other day that I didn't believe in Horatio Alger stories, but it does seem like Morris did take advantage of the fact that things were kind of wild and woolly in the colonies, and managed to build himself up in ways that required quick thinking and a little bit of risk, and not but not the kind of stories that you hear of people today, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and people like that who seem quite obviously to be made men. And
Morris had an uncanny sense of risk and reward. He would just double up. He would go, well, great, we made $100 today. Let's put it on the next mission. And then he'd turn the 100 into 400 into 1,000 and just keep doubling up, and got bigger and bigger as a result.
He played double or nothing until he had nothing.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me see. Arthur Stone, who lives in Great Britain, says John Paul Jones used to anchor in a bay near my home. Was he pillaging?
Morris
Arthur?
used to call John Paul Jones Little Jones.
Little Jones?
Jones.
Okay.
And because he was smaller, Morris was like 6'2" or something. And so John Paul Jones claimed to have been the first man to hoist the American flag. And according to the Betsy Ross story, Morris's ship was the flag that Jones hoisted the flag onto. So when Betsy Ross delivered the flag to Morris, he took the flag to his ship, and John Paul Jones hoisted it up the mast of one of Morris's ships, and then they went, and everybody went, hooray! And then they went down to the State House for a meeting of the Marine Committee, and the Congress said, yeah, this is a good flag. Let's vote this in. That basically was what happened.
Well, I think that's probably a good way to leave off our conversation today. Do you have anything else?
Thank you, Peter, for inviting me.
You're welcome. Do you have anything else that you want to ask me, though?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a 600-page book. So God bless everybody who buys it and reads it, because you'll learn a lot about America and the forces at work in the beginning of the country and how they're still active. I think people can see that as they read through.
One of the things that you sent me a link to yesterday, though, is that you're working on a podcast. Is that correct? On the book?
Well, yeah, we've got a little podcast that we're going to be doing every week. We'll have a new installation on that. Yeah, we're going to do that.
And what is that going to be, like each chapter of the book, or are you reading the book, or
a little kind of discussion about every chapter? About Morris lost his brother during the war, who was a spy in France, and lots of little stories that get kind of build up to a bigger story. I don't know how to say it. As I say, I started off with a PowerPoint and ended up at a 600-page book, so I can talk a lot about it.
Indeed. Well, White Rose says, great interview. Thank you, Rob Morris and Mr. Duke. And thank you, White Rose, for that comment. And if people want to know more about what you're doing, I've put the URL underneath your picture there. It's rm1776.com. The book, Robert Morris, Inside the Revolution, by Robert M. Morris, is available everywhere where you can get good books, and it's from Trine Day. Chris Milligan, who's
great publisher,
out there,
excellent fellow,
doing the Lord's work, bringing the truth to people. And so, thank you, Rob Morris, for joining us here today. And if you are interested in the book, go to rm1776.com or go check it out on Amazon. And I look forward to your podcast on the book.
Well, thank you very much.
Because I think that your ancestor is somebody that more people need to understand, not only who he is, but what he was doing. Because as long as we don't understand how to fund the things that are oppressing us, we won't be able to do anything about it. So with that, I will say hasta la vista, and thank you very much. Talk to you soon. Bye, Rob. Bye, everybody.